Okay, so welcome back again. I hope you all have the handouts, and we'll have now Jessica Pepps. So,
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, so thank you for having me here, and to everyone involved in the organization of this event, which has been very exciting and profitable so far. The paper that I'm going to present today is, it's got a kind of varying title at the moment, so I think it's listed in the program as The Unity of Pronouns in Referential Semantics. And here on the handout, it's The Unity of Pronouns in Ordinary English. So I guess we have to make up our mind about the title. But whatever it's called, this is joint work that I've been doing with Paul Nichols and Joseph Almag. We published or are about to publish a sort of first essay in what we think will be a series of 3, of which this is the second. This is the second part in progress. And the aim of the series as a whole is to give the semantics of English nominals, so proper nouns, common nouns, noun phrases, and pronouns, as they occur in our ordinary, everyday English. The focus of the series is on pronouns, but in a way, the nature of the approach is such that we can't exactly separate the treatment of pronouns from the treatment of other nominals. So in a sense, it's all coming together. In the first essay in the series, we launched a framework for treating all occurrences of English pronouns as referential. And here we're going to develop that framework in essence by sort of trying it out on a number of traditionally troubling kinds of uses of pronouns. And in doing that, we hope to sort of show something that's appealing about our way of looking at things, and also just to sort of test out and put some meat on the bones of the account a bit. So I'm going to start, and this is section 1 on your handout, with a brief recap of the objectives that we've undertaken in starting in the first essay in this series. And there's two guiding objectives that we have for this semantic treatment. The grammatical objective is to treat nouns, noun phrases, and pronouns as they occur in the perceptible, or if you like, surface grammar of ordinary English. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by that, you've got a bunch of sentences there on the handout. John loves Rover. John loves his dog. Every chemist loves his dog. All of these sentences are treated in our account as subject, verb, object in form. Likewise, John walks. John's dog walks. Every chemist walks. All are treated as subject, verb, and you could also have sort of subject, copula, adjective if you have things like John is happy. John's dog is happy. Every chemist is happy. And encompassing all of this, all these sentences are subject predicate. So the grammatical objective is to just stick with that, so not to introduce underlying invisible forms, but to go with what we perceive, what's there on the surface. The semantical objective is to appeal only to what we consider the fundamental semantic relation of reference and not to denotation. So I need to say a little bit about that because the terms reference and denotation are often used interchangeably. We're here tracking a sort of way of making this distinction that I think goes back to Russell and was made explicit, at any rate, by Donlan. So I'm not going to give exactly either, and the way I'm going to characterize the distinction is not either exactly the way Russell would have characterized it or exactly the way Donlan would have characterized it, but it's inspired by their ideas. So denotation is a relation between an expression, as used on a given occasion, and an entity or entities, wherein that entity or entities satisfy a condition introduced by the expression on the occasion of use. In contrast with that, reference is a relation between an expression used on a given occasion and an entity or entities, wherein that entity or entities cause the use of the expression on the occasion. Now, it's obvious from looking at this, looking at these two characterizations, that they're not definitions or analyses or necessary and sufficient conditions or theories of reference or denotation. The characterizations are merely aimed at bringing out the contrast between these two relations. There's much more to be said about what else it is to be in a relation of reference or to be in a relation of denotation. But all I'm pointing at here is this basic difference between the two kinds of relation, and our semantics takes reference rather than denotation as the fundamental relation for the natural language semantics to work with. Okay, so those are the two objectives. In the first essay in this series, we introduced two possible models for treating pronouns, and we called them the noun phrase model and the noun model. The noun phrase model explored the idea that only complete noun phrases refer, and that pronouns linked to complete noun phrases refer via the referring of the noun phrases. In the noun model, which is the one that I'm going to be pursuing here, it's nouns, really single words in general, but since we're focused on nominals, we talk about nouns. It's single word nouns that refer, not compounds. Pronouns that are linked to nouns refer via the referring of the nouns. So one note about this is that it means that, for instance, John, the proper name, as it appears in John Loves Rover or John Loves His Dog up above, refers, while every chemist, that's a compound phrase, does not refer. And I think one question that might arise is whether this violates the objective of perceptible grammar that we set up, since it seems that both of these things are grammatical subjects, and yet we're claiming that one of them refers and the other doesn't. The answer to this is no, because we are not seeking to have an isomorphism between syntactic unities, aka grammatical subjects, and semantic unities, or reference or semantic subjects. All we see here broadly is to treat expressions of the same grammatical type in the same way semantically, and as you'll see as we go on, we do that in any grammatical subject, it's the head noun that refers to the subject of predication, and in the case where that's just a proper name, then it's the proper name that refers, but in a case like every chemist loves his dog, it's chemist that refers and is the subject of predication. A second sort of thing to flag, I won't talk about this in a lot of detail, but I'm happy to go into it more in questions. One might wonder whether this claim that compound phrases don't refer implies that compound phrases can't be used referentially in the manner of Donlan, as in the man drinking a martini case that's been discussed quite a bit already today. The short answer, when we develop it a bit more in the paper, but the short answer to it is no. But on referential uses, compounds function as single words rather than as compounds. So this is an elaboration of Strawson's idea that in some cases, definite descriptions grow capitals, as he put it. So he had the example of the Holy Roman Empire. There are plenty of other examples. One that I find sort of useful is the National Organization for Women. These are definite descriptions that are used as, in effect, as names. They refer to particular objects. And our view about referential uses is that, in effect, it's the same thing that's happening. So there hasn't been a conventionalized process so that people regularly refer to Fred as the man drinking the martini. But what's going on semantically is effectively the same thing. The reference to Fred is overwhelming the compoundness of the phrase that's used to do it. So that's the short answer. We can come back to that later. Okay, so in order to get our view a little bit more on the table and show you a bit how it treats pronouns, I want to use a dilemma about the unity of pronouns that was raised by Gareth Evans way back in 1980 and very helpfully discussed by Francois more recently, and we've been helped by his clear way of setting out Evans's dilemma in working on this. I think starting with the dilemma is useful both because it's a good opportunity to spell out a little bit more what we want to say about various cases of pronoun use, but also because it is, in a sense, it is one problem, I guess, that our approach, we think, helps to dissolve. The problem is that you have these different types of use of pronoun, and I've listed them as type 1, type 2, and type 3. And they seem to be quite different, and yet the word his, as used in each of these sentences, is just this one word his, and it doesn't seem to be an ambiguous word. So there's a question about what is it that unifies all these different uses. These uses, I guess, are most commonly called deictic, anaphoric, and bound. I haven't called them that because part of our view is that pronouns are not bound, ever. Pronouns refer, and they don't function as variables. So I've just called them type 1, type 2, and type 3 to get out the types of use that are at issue. So type 1, John loves his mother. The use of his, so assuming a case where the use of his is not linked to the use of John. So his maybe refers to someone who's seen or remembered or otherwise relevant, let's say Peter, but importantly not via the previous utterance of John. So the sentence then, as used, predicates of John loving Peter's mother. In the type 2 kind of use, his is linked to the use of the single word John earlier in the sentence. On that kind of use, his refers via this earlier utterance of John to whatever it was that John referred to, let's say John, a guy John. Then the sentence as used predicates of John loving John's mother, not Peter's or someone else's. Now, type 3 is the one that is where things get a bit trickier. Every man loves his mother. This is a case where the use of his is linked to the use of the compound phrase every man. So now we have a difference in that we've got a pronoun linked to a compound phrase. So how does our account treat this sentence? The first thing that we note about it is that it's subject, verb, object. Every man loves his mother. The common noun man refers to men. That is the plurality of men. The common noun mother refers to mothers. And so at some most basic initial level of description, what's going on in the use of this sentence is that the plurality of men are being predicated with loving the plurality of mothers. There's more to it than that because we've got modifiers in here. So what do? Well, the word every modifies that predication so that the plurality of men is predicated with loving the plurality of mothers with respect to every member of that plurality of men. The modifying pronoun his, we say, refers also, it's possessive, but it refers also to men via the use of man. So the predication then is restricted to loving the plurality of men's mothers. So what's still missing, obviously, is that we don't, so we've got that the plurality of men with respect to every member of that plurality is predicated with loving the plurality of men's mothers. What we don't have is the arrangement in which that predication is happening. That is, we don't have the arrangement in which men have to stand in the loving relation to men's mothers in order for the sentence to be true. This is because his, although it determines the common noun mother, refers back to a common noun refers back through a common noun man, and so introduces some additional indeterminacy. But the sentence provides the resources to resolve this through the phrase his mother, i.e. the plurality, so that's referring to the plurality of mothers of men. And this introduces the arrangement in which men are related to mothers via possession. So the arrangement in which men stand in the relation of possession to mothers. That arrangement is then available to be the arrangement in which men are required to stand in the relation of loving to men's mothers. And it is picked up as such. So we get the final truth condition that the sentence is, as used, is true if and only if the plurality of men, with respect to every member, stands in the relation of loving to the plurality of mothers in the arrangement in which the former plurality stands in the relation of possessing to the latter plurality. I guess one thing to sort of note about this is that I haven't in stating this truth condition given a full algorithm for computing what it is. So what I've done is to rather describe in more detail what the truth condition is by using the resources of what the individual words refer to and the perceptible grammar of the sentence. The arrangement that is, we can all see, the arrangement that is the one in which men are required to love men's mothers for the sentence to be true, is provided by the words in the sentence. The way in which it's computed as the required arrangement is not something, so may not be something that can be quickly stated in a few lines. That kind of I think of it as analogous to the kind of computation that's involved in seeing things. We know that there is some sort of computation, and it's a finite process that could be spelled out, but we don't take it as the duty here to do that. Rather, we try to elucidate what the truth conditions are and how the reference of the words provides the materials for the truth conditions. Okay, so that was all by way of just sort of setting out how this account treats cases where pronouns are referring back via compound phrases. An important feature of this account that I want to flag, because it's going to be important for the dilemma that Evans raises that I'm about to discuss, is that only used expressions or uses of expressions refer. And this just comes out of our commitment to reference rather than denotation as the fundamental semantic relation. You can't have something causing a use if there's no use. So reference is something that used expressions have. So keeping that in mind, here's a problem that Evans raises for a view something like this, at least insofar as requiring uses of expressions for referentiality. So Evans says, we must account for the fact that type 3 uses have type 2 substitution instances. And he thinks this is what connects type 3 and type 2 uses, and it furthermore makes type 2 uses more basic than type 3 uses. But, he asks, to those who may think that type 2 uses function via his referring to the thing introduced by the use of John, how can type 2 pronoun occurrences be substitution instances of type 3 if they have to be used? Because substitution instances, by definition, are not used. So if I say every man loves his mother, the idea is it has all these substitution instances, but they're not used when I use every man loves his mother. And so our sort of response to this is that we agree that type 2 and type 3 uses are connected. And we further agree that type 2 uses are more basic than type 3 uses. But we think that this basicness is due to the fact that type 2 uses are linked to single words, whereas type 3 uses are linked to compound phrases. And the former, the type 2 uses, or the single words that are involved, are grammatically more basic. So incidentally, we think that the same observation holds about what we consider to be also a type 3 use, a case like dutiful John loves his mother, compared with, say, the type 2 use John loves his mother. This type 3 use, dutiful John loves his mother, is also more complicated than the type 2 use, and it's also a case in which the reference is not performed by the whole phrase dutiful John, but by the head noun John. John is predicated with loving, let's say, John's mother, and the predication is either modified by or added to it is being dutiful. And one could debate about exactly how that works into the truth conditions. I think it's actually intuitively unclear. So that's the first point, that type 2 uses are more basic than type 3, not because they're substitution instances of type 3, but because they are grammatically simpler. As far as the fundamental connection between these kinds of uses, that we take to be semantic. So every man loves his mother, a use of that may entail John loves his mother, if in fact, in the use of John loves his mother, John refers to a man, and man refers to the plurality of men, and so John is a member of that plurality, then we have an entailment from the use of the one to the use of the other. But that's a kind of a posteriori semantic fact, not an a priori syntactic one. Okay, so I guess moving on. So that's the first kind of thing that we take this approach to accomplish is that it unifies the different uses of pronouns as all being referential. Contra Evans, it seems to us not to be the case that if you want to have a referential approach to type 2 uses, that you can't then unify them with type 3 uses. What I'm going to move to next is what I've called on the handout troublemakers. So these are cases of pronoun use that are traditionally held up as being difficult for various accounts of the semantics of pronouns. There's nothing difficult about them from the perspective of an ordinary speaker, so we all understand them and we know what their truth conditions are. But they're difficult for certain ways of representing language. And so by running through them, I'm going to try to show how on this referential surface grammar approach, they don't look so difficult. All right, so I'll start in section 3.1 with the donkey sentences. So I'm going to talk about both conditional donkey sentences and universal donkey sentences with relative clauses. The problem, sort of traditional problem posed by these kinds of sentences is that the pronoun in the case of sentence 1, the pronoun it seems that it can't be represented as a bound variable, but neither does it refer to a particular donkey. So no particular donkey is referred to in the sentence. And so the puzzle is how can this pronoun be treated? The key for us for dealing with this problem is this idea that common nouns refer and pronouns linked to common nouns refer through them, or at least they can. So let me just sort of walk through the treatment of the truth conditions for this sentence. If a farmer owns a donkey, he loves it. I want to start out by noting that although there's a kind of target reading of this sentence that's the problematic one, there are actually lots of readings or ways that this sentence might be used that I'll set aside, but I want to mention them. So each of the indefinite noun phrases could be specific or referential, and this starts to sound more plausible if you develop more those phrases. So if you change it to, if a farmer I used to know owns a donkey I saw outside the barn yesterday, he loves it. Those kind of lengthenings of the indefinite phrases make it quite plausible seeming that it's a particular individual referred to, and in those kinds of cases, you could even have situations where the thing referred to isn't a farmer or isn't a donkey, and Donlan kind of cases. Furthermore, either of those pronouns, he and it, could be type 1 or type 3. So they could just refer to particular things, perceived or had in mind or whatever. And then further, with the indefinite, it can be read as nonspecific, as general, as numerical, as universal. There are lots of different ways to hear it, and we view those just as sort of straightforward ambiguities in the word a. But for the purposes of running through this, I'll just consider a nonspecific use for both a farmer and a donkey, and both pronouns as being type 3. So referring back via the compound phrases. So the assumption is that he refers via the compound phrase farmer, but so in particular via the referring noun farmer to the plurality of farmers, and it refers via donkey to the plurality of donkeys. It's worth noting, even here, there's more possibilities in that could be reversed. Maybe he refers to donkeys and it to farmers, if somebody has a different view about the animacy of farmers and donkeys. It could also be that he refers via donkeys and it refers to, say, the state of being owned by a farmer. There are lots of options, but again, I'll set those aside. So first thing to say is that as I've been stressing, the sentence here is subject, verb, object. On a use of this kind that's under consideration, the sort of starting truth condition is that the sentence as used is true if and only if the plurality of farmers stands in the relation of loving to the plurality of donkeys in some arrangement. So that's just the he loves it part. Now, the if clause restricts the evaluation for truth to a circumstance in which the plurality of farmers, with respect to some members or others, since we're taking the non-specific reading, stands in the relation of owning to the plurality of donkeys with respect to some members or others. So we have this sort of basic truth condition. We have the circumstances for which it's evaluated for truth restricted by the if clause. And then we need the arrangement in which the plurality of farmers is required to stand in the relation of loving to the plurality of donkeys for the sentence to be true. And as in the case of every man loves his mother that I discussed, there's an arrangement of farmers and donkeys that's already been presented in the sentence. And that's the arrangement in which the plurality of farmers stands in the relation of owning to the plurality of donkeys. That arrangement is provided as the one in which the farmers must stand in the relation of loving to donkeys. So the sentence in total as used is true if and only if in a situation where some farmers or other own some donkeys or other, farmers love donkeys in the arrangement in which farmers own donkeys. Okay. For the universal form of the donkey sentence, the treatment is really much the same. So again, we can set aside lots of possibilities and just consider a non-specific indefinite and a type 3 pronoun. So again, we assume that it is referring via donkey to the plurality of donkeys. Again, the sentence is subject, verb, object. And that subject, verb, object frame generates the basic truth condition that it's true if and only if the plurality of farmers stand in the relation of loving to the plurality of donkeys. The subject referent is restricted to those members of the plurality of farmers who own a donkey, some donkey or other. And once again, we then still need the arrangement in which loving, the arrangement in which farmers who own donkeys, with respect to every one of them, must stand in the relation of loving to the plurality of donkeys. And the relative clause has introduced an arrangement between farmers and donkeys, that of owning, which in turn provides the arrangement in which farmers must stand in the relation of loving to donkeys. So again, we get I think are the natural truth conditions, that the sentence as used is true if and only if the plurality of farmers, with respect to every one of those who own some donkeys or other, stands in the loving relation to the plurality of donkeys in the same arrangement in which the former plurality stands in the owning relationship to the latter. Okay, let's take a drink. How am I on time? 10 minutes? Okay. So that's good, actually. I mean, I think, so I have a bunch more cases, and I'm happy to talk about them when we get to the questions or later, but in a sense, it's the same thing. So it's just playing out this methodology to elucidate the truth conditions of various kinds of traditionally problematic sentences in an effort to illustrate that they're not that problematic if you just stick with the perceptible grammar and the references of the words, and cease to look for a sort of graspable calculation from the syntax by itself to the truth conditions. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes then, I'm just going to skip to section 4, which is called From Putnam to Pronouns. Because I want to say a little bit about this general methodology. I'm sure people are thinking that this is this sounds just like cheating. You've sort of absolved yourself of the responsibility to actually compute the truth conditions in an easy way, and you're just telling me what they are in a little more detail. And that's true in a sense, but I think we have good reason for doing it. So I just want to say a little bit about that motivation and that and sort of where it comes from, to try to get a few more ideas on the table that maybe we can discuss. So really what I've been doing here is treating reference of words and truth conditions of sentences as perceived. And I want to say ultimately literally perceived, but that's a big argument with lots of angles to it. So if you like, think of it as on the analogy of perception or as an extended form of perception, something like that. So I guess what's important about this is that I've been trying to then elucidate what it is that we perceive in a bit more detail. So to sort of say what we're perceiving is the reference of these terms kind of set up in a certain way so that we get predication of them and objectification of them. But I haven't been, as I said, I haven't been sort of giving a complete computation from pure syntax to truth conditions. The idea here then is that these truth conditions, of course, are computed, but not by any algorithm that's more graspable, say, than the computations involved in visual perception. So I'm going to try to say a little bit about this analogy between reference and perception, or maybe it's more than an analogy, by going back many years to Putnam's 1970 paper, Is Semantics Possible? We kind of drew inspiration from Putnam in getting started on this. This is a paper where Putnam is worried about whether the kind of, at that time, newly burgeoning model theoretic semantic project is something that can actually be carried out. And there are two things I want to highlight that Putnam on our way of reading his paper sort of pointed out. So I'll sort of flag, I guess, that this isn't kind of Putnam exegesis, and he may not have had any of these ideas in mind, but it's something that was suggested by this paper. So the first one is that the key to natural language semantics is lexical semantics. What Putnam worried about in this 1970 paper was that model theoretic semantics seemed to sort of just abstract away from the lexical semantics, treat the meanings or reference of words as whatever would do for the theory. And he thought that the real action in natural language semantics was there at the lexical level. How is it that a word actually brings with it or gets us onto a piece of the world? And we very much agree with this and think that real semantics of natural language has to engage with the external history of words and how they actually get us in contact with the objects that they refer to or the things that they mean. The second point, so the second point from Putnam that we want to take is, and here we are definitely expanding a little bit on what he actually said, is that lexical items refer rather than denote. So this is how we take not only Putnam's sort of more famous twin earth stuff, but also just this example that he discusses in this paper of the word lemon. We take the point there to be that when I use the word lemon, it's the lemons, the actual things that have caused us to have this word and use this word, that are channeled to me. So this is a case of reference, not denotation. Putnam goes through a lot of work to show that we can't sort of decompose the word lemon or the notion of lemon into a set of conceptual bits that will pick out the things. And these two observations about noun reference suggest to us a strong analogy, and as I said, indeed, we think it's more than that, with perception. And although I can't pursue this in a lot of detail here, I've only got a few minutes left, but I just want to say a little bit about the analogy by pointing out some similarities that are suggested in Putnam's paper between perceiving words and through words and perceiving photographs and through photographs, so a visual process. Okay, so some analogies. Two nouns, as used, may seem the same but not be, and so the reference may not be the same. There's plenty of cases of this. Analogously, two photographs may look the same, but not be printed from the same exposure, and so they may not show the same things. Second analogy, a noun, as used, may seem to refer to something, though it doesn't. Likewise, a photograph may seem to show something, though it doesn't. This is the case of empty nouns. Third, two nouns, as used, may be different and yet have the same referent. So likewise, two photographs may be from different exposures and yet show the same things. And fourth, the relation of referring between a noun as used and a referent is necessary and a posteriori. This is an important point, I think an important sort of divergence of our view from many views. A noun could not have referred to anything but what it does, and users do not know a priori what that is. This is just exactly analogous to photographs, which could not have been of anything but what they are of, and are not known a priori to be of what they are of by those who look at them. And so just to sort of, I guess just to sum up a bit, for us, perceiving through used nouns and in following on from that through pronouns is like perceiving through photographs. Objects cause what you might call an exposure, so they're named or they're photographed. The exposure event brings about further items, utterances of nouns or prints of a photograph. These are themselves perceptible, and the original object is also perceptible through them. In using a noun, we perceive both the used noun and through it its referent. And pronouns are just more nouns. We can perceive through them other used nouns and through those used nouns referents. Or we can simply perceive reference through the uses of pronouns as we do when they're used in the type 1 kind of way. So those are just some sort of very initial remarks toward this more general perceptual approach to semantics. The gist for my purposes today, is that we can't abstract away from the facts of how a use of language came about and calculate semantic facts from an internal underlying syntax. Semantic facts are, in this sense, a kind of perceptual fact. Uttered sentences look, sort of quote-unquote look, syntactically as they do. There's no revision necessary. But their look or form doesn't determine their semantics any more than the look of photographs determines what they're of or what scene they display. Although there are, of course, important correlations and correspondences, and those are the things that's what I've been exploring in sort of setting out and elucidating the truth conditions in the various cases. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So, thank you. So, the commentator Pedro Santos couldn't come, but he did send his comments, and Peter Pagin has agreed to read them. So I'm very grateful, thankful.
Okay.
Should be here. Yeah. Oops.
Sorry.
So I guess you can do that. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And they can also read it. So that's it.
Yeah, I'll try to. Quote, the paper co-authored by Jessica Pepp et al. Presents a number of challenges concerning the reference of pronouns in natural language. One general goal is to motivate a unified treatment of pronouns in all kinds of environments, namely those related to what is usually described as deictic, anaphoric, and bound interpretations of pronouns. Another is to further a Putnam-inspired conception of reference that it is claimed traditional formal approaches to the semantics of natural language, and in particular to the semantics of nominal reference, do not do justice to. The testbed for the paper's proposals are a number of vexed issues in the treatment of pronouns. For lack of space/time, I will focus on just a couple of issues, leaving out a lot out. One, the unification issue. On the issue of Evans's dilemma, Jessica's point is that it is a false dilemma, bears on the claim that no real binding is involved in the so-called bound uses of pronouns. But I fail to see how a framework that assigns to nouns such reference as pluralities can account for the co-reference constraints in, for instance, every man loves his mother, especially if the instantiation relation is kicked out of the picture against Evans. It's not clear what exactly takes its place. 2, donkey sentences. Among the troublemakers addressed by the paper, I will focus on donkey sentences, as my general worry here concerns the paper's basic assumptions about reference and co-reference, and therefore could arguably be seen as applying to the other problematic phenomena discussed. The paper offers an analysis of donkey sentences along the lines of what is called the noun model. That is, assumes that in donkey sentences, pronouns refer through a referential link with an antecedent noun, as opposed to an antecedent noun phrase. This strikes me as problematic. I will begin by some stage setting. Donkey sentences were one major issue in bringing to light the shortcomings of Montague grammar. A specific mention of Montague grammar is in order here, for at least 2 reasons. The first is that it has been taken deservedly to be the paradigm for a formal treatment of natural language semantics, to which a number of other theories eventually reacted. The second is that Jessica's paper also takes MG as the framework representing the kind of overall view she criticizes, especially concerning nominal reference. Historically, a crucial kind of criticism of MG had to do with the adoption of a dynamic incremental view of meaning, and in particular of pronoun reference. It seems that an holistic view, as espoused by MG, is out of touch with the way speakers really process linguistic sequences, notably those involving pronouns. Furthermore, MG, or any traditional non-dynamic treatment of pronouns, also gets the reference of some pronouns wrong, namely in cases like the following discussed in Evans 1977. First, exactly one minister resigned, he was caught red-handed. 2, most ministers resigned, they were caught red-handed. If we go for a bound variable treatment of these kinds of sequences in the traditional style, such that the quantifier expressions bind the pronouns in the second sentence, then we get inappropriate truth conditions for each sequence. For instance, if we read 1 along the lines of exactly one minister resigned and was caught red-handed, then we would let 1 be true if exactly one minister was caught red-handed but more than one resigned, which is of course unacceptable. So besides not being sensitive to the fact that the mechanism of reference assignment across sequences of sentences within one complex discourse is incremental, a Montagovian account of these referential relations yields wrong predictions about truth conditions in cases like sentences 1 and 2. Related problems affect the Montague treatment of donkey sentences, such as 3, if a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it, and 4, every farmer who owns a donkey beats it. A Montagovian kind of framework presents a number of shortcomings when dealing with these kinds of sentence. In particular, Roman 1 does not provide an explanation of why certain co-reference relations in apparently the same kind of syntactic environment as 1/2 are impossible with other kinds of quantifier expressions. For instance, those with universal force. This is assuming a la mg, a quantifier reading for the indefinite noun phrase, as in star Mary invited no colleagues and Jane phoned them, / every student failed, he was greatly disappointed. 2, Roman 2. It's also, crucially, does not offer a way of getting the right truth conditions that is systematic, let alone compositional. I'm not assuming compositionality is a requirement of every sound semantic theory, especially having in mind my appeal to DRT below, but systematicity surely is. In particular, it fails to make the right predictions about the universal readings of indefinite NPs in donkey sentences like 3 and 4, while allowing for the existential reading in other environments. DRT successfully deals with both 1 and 2. I'm aware that discussion of DRT, among other frameworks, is announced for the 3rd paper of the series, but it could arguably have been included in this one to great advantage. I will focus on 2 as this topic is directly relevant to Jessica's main point when discussing donkey sentences. By and large, discourse representation theory, or DRT, proposed by H. Kamp in 1981 and independently by I. Heim in 1982, treats each indefinite NP as a predicate combined with a free variable rather than as an existential quantifier proper. A farmer is analyzed as farmer X. According to the framework, in most linguistic contexts, the semantics provided for this kind of combination makes sure that it is true just in case some assignment of a value to the variable is in the extension of the predicate, essentially the truth conditions of an existentially quantified formula of the predicate calculus, but without any quantifier actually entering into the picture. So no binding proper as well, which is a way of explaining why sentences with the real quantifiers don't have to follow the referential patterns of indefinite NPs, as seen above, substituting for no colleagues and every student for indefinite NPs would give us ungrammatical sequences where indefinites would be grammatical. Furthermore, and crucially, by letting the free variable provided by the indefinite noun phrase be bound by either a conditional operator which ranges over every assignment of values of that free variable, possibly but not necessarily by means of a Stolnakerian semantics for indicative conditionals in sentence 3, or by the universal quantifier every to the same effect in sentence 4, we get the desired universal reading of the indefinite in both cases. This is not to claim that DRT, influential as it is in the formal semantics community to this day, is the last word on the semantics of pronouns, in particular those appearing in donkey sentences, nor that it is itself immune to problems, the issue of compositionality being one of the most obvious. My point is merely that the kind of approach that eschews an analysis of indefinite NPs as quantifiers that bind variables, as seems reasonable to do in view of non-binding evidence in those same structures environments, has some traction in dealing with the kind of co-referential links displayed in donkey sentences, and, crucially, in combining those co-reference relations with just the right kind of readings for those sentences. Jessica's paper doesn't seem to meet this basic goal. In DRT, coreference is accounted for by a number of formal restrictions on what practitioners of the theory call discourse representations. Furthermore, both existential and universal readings of indefinites are generated under the assumption that indefinite noun phrases are the antecedents of the corresponding pronouns, crucially acting as providers of discourse markers, essentially free variables, to which the relevant predicates apply for each assignment of a referent to such a discourse marker. If the coreference relation in these cases is to be set between a pronoun and a noun, as opposed to an indefinite noun phrase, it is less than clear how just a particular individual for each particular assignment within the plurality referred by the noun could be picked out as required. Section 3. A further issue concerns rigidity of general terms. If general terms are to designate abstract entities like kinds, possibly construed as intentions, then Kripkean rigidity arguments seem to be able to apply to them, just as in the case of names. On the other hand, if general terms are to designate their extensions, rigidity seems to be out of the question, since the extension of a general term varies across possible worlds. Alternatively, we could say that a general term is rigid if and only if given object X, if for any given object X it applies to X in every possible world where X exists. This criterion of rigid application, as Devitt 2005 called it, would thus set natural kind general terms like tiger apart from non-natural kind general terms such as teacher or farmer. Perhaps we don't want to keep this distinction, at least under these terms. A number of authors don't. But one thing we also don't probably want to say is that a general term like farmer is rigid. Now, the account of nouns adopted in the paper seems to be committed to the idea that nouns, in particular common nouns, are directly referential. This is what I take to be a consequence of the adoption of the referential view as opposed to the denotational view. And while not all rigid designators are directly referential, it is plausible to say that if a designator is directly referential, then it is rigid. And if this is so, farmer would come out as rigid. This strikes me as somewhat awkward. On the other hand, the paper defends the idea that all general terms refer to pluralities. If these pluralities are to be understood as the extensions of those terms at a given world W, then a natural kind term like tiger would refer to different pluralities in different worlds and would therefore come out as non-rigid, which is also awkward. So it seems that those pluralities would have to be construed in a different way. The paper does not elaborate on this. Section 4. The paper espouses a general methodological view about the status of semantic analysis, appealing to perceptible grammar and to a perceptual kind of semantic analysis, namely in the analysis of reference. This idea is most forcefully expressed by contrast with Montague grammar, for instance, in what concerns the Montagovian treatment of all pronouns as variables. This is indeed an extreme example of a counterintuitive result that formalization may produce, but it sets the tone of the paper's critical references about formalization, logical reductions, and the like, and such like. My concern here is that if this critical attitude can be interpreted as applying to all model theoretic frameworks whatsoever, including DRT, which provides a number of improvements over Montague grammar, namely as regards the treatment of pronouns in problematic cases like donkey sentences. A lot remains to be said in the way of an elaboration of what the alternative to those frameworks might be, besides the somewhat vague references to perceptual grammar and perceptual semantics." Unquote.
Well, okay, I think, so these are very useful comments. I'm afraid that, yeah, having them read, and I probably won't be able to sort of process them all just here. I think, I guess just to say one thing about DRT, as Pedro noted in the comments, we are planning to discuss DRT more in the next installment. It's just got to be too big to take on in one paper. One thing to say about it is that one reason we don't want to go that way is this need to, or not need, is the fact that part of what's involved in Comp's treatment, say, of donkey sentences is switching the noun farmer, which we take to refer to farmers, to a predicate so that you can get farmer X and treat things in that way. We want to keep the nouns as nouns and keep them as referential, so that's one reason that we want to articulate an alternative to DRT. It's not an argument against it, but our approach has some different goals. With respect to the co-reference constraints, so I guess that what Pedro was picking up on is kind of what I'd been flagging throughout about not giving a kind of not giving a easily graspable computation of these what I call arrangements. I think that so what I want to say about that is that the arrangements that end up being the ones that the arrangements which we take as as involved in the intuitive truth conditions are presented in the sentences, and the goal for us is not to enable say particular individual farmers to be picked out one by one. It's part of our view that when the sentences are used without, say, a farmer referring to a particular guy, that the noun farmer just refers to that whole plurality of farmers, that we don't need to get reference to particular farmers in order to generate the desired truth conditions. So I guess that's something to say about that. Maybe I should stop and open it up.
So thanks. It was very interesting talk. I have a very simple question about this idea that the pronouns linked to pronouns refer via the referring of the nouns. I mean, so you don't want to say that these are anaphoric or bound uses, but I mean, this sounds very similar to anaphoric or bound use. I mean, the reference is fixed via another noun, so it's. So is there really? I mean, I have a little trouble really seeing the difference. Is it so? At some point, I thought that you maybe thought of this as a pragmatic thing. So perhaps along the lines of Kent Bach, that he thinks that there's no syntactic binding or anything like that, but it's just a matter of what is made sort of pragmatically salient by the use of other expressions, something like that. But that doesn't seem to be what you have in mind either. So I was wondering exactly what is what does this amount to? This referring via other nouns, and how can you spell it out in a way that doesn't make it seem as much like binding or anaphora as it does to me now? I'm probably missing something, but
Okay, yeah, I mean, so, well, so there is the fact that, we all kind of know roughly what the truth conditions of these sentences are, and I'm not proposing something drastically different from what other people have proposed. That's certainly true. So calling things anaphoric, I guess, is not something I'm opposed to. If you think about, so if you wanted to say that, some pronouns are anaphoric on other nouns, be they proper or common, in that they are referring via the referring of those nouns. The resistance was to thinking of pronouns as bound variables. So that's why I said I don't want to call the uses bound uses. That the pronouns on our way of thinking about it aren't. There isn't a level of syntax underneath the visible stuff that's got bound variables in it where the pronouns used to be. It's rather that you've got the pronouns and they refer. So in a sense, if you thought John loves his mother, his is anaphoric, then one way you could put what we're saying is every man loves his mother, his is anaphoric also. It's anaphoric on mother, rather than John. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the difference is in how we're taking the grammar to be and how we're taking that to structure the truth conditions.
Can I have a brief follow-up? Yeah, very, very quickly. So how these seem to be sort of quite different mechanisms from direct reference, I mean, referring by another expression. How do you think that sort of this idea that you want a unified account?
Mm-hmm.
You still think that's a correct way to describe it? I mean, when you have these, in order to account for these uses, you need this other mechanisms, which looks pretty much like some kind of anaphoric process, even if you don't want to use that term or distinguish it from variables. But
yeah, so I see the question. So I guess my answer to that is I said this a little bit at the end, but that it's on the model of perceiving through photographs. I mean, that's one model you could think of it. So it's true that seeing someone in a photograph is different in various ways from seeing them, right in front of you. But so in some sense, a different mechanism is involved. But in some sense, also there's a common mechanism, which is just perception. So I'm able to perceive things, right in front of me. I'm able to perceive things through that mirror. In the back, I'm able to perceive things on, CCTV. I think I'm able to perceive things through photographs. So it's that kind of idea, and this is why I said it's, this is a huge topic, so, there's a lot of work to do to sort of establish that is perception or isn't or whatever, but I think the mechanism is similar in that kind of way. So that would be the analogy. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. I was wondering about the arrangements. I understand from the general sentiment that you would be opposed to anything like logical form or anything like that, but in this presentation, it's hard to see exactly how the appeal to arrangement achieves the proper disambiguation that you're interested in. And so whether loves, for instance, takes another argument, takes 3 arguments rather than 2, where the arrangement is the 3rd argument, or whether we have arrangement as working as some kind of operator on top of the subject, verb, object structure. So let me take one example. One of the most standard examples of syntactic ambiguity is the sentence, "Every man loves a woman." And I guess you want to preserve the ambiguity of that. You wouldn't want to deny that's ambiguous. And so then I would wonder how in your framework would you account for the ambiguity? Would you say that it has truth conditions in one arrangement that corresponds to the universal existential reading, and then another arrangement to the existential universal reading? And if you would treat that as a kind of prefix, it starts looking a bit like notational variant.
Let's see. So there, just thinking aloud. There must be some space between notational variants and how do I want to put this? So there's something substantive to positing an underlying logical form to the sentences. I mean, if we want to think of what the kind of account on my behalf that you just offered as a notational variant of a sort of logical form account, then it seems to me that the logical form account has lost some of what it's supposed to do, because the idea of that account is that this sentence really has that sentence has an underlying structure. So it has two possible underlying structures. And on the account I would want to give, it's got just one structure. Subject, verb, object. So every man loves a woman. And men loving women in some arrangement, and different arrangements are made available. I think that's not just notational variance. My view posits semantic ambiguity, where the view you're suggesting posits syntactic ambiguity, and I think those are different. We can, I mean, I suppose by backing off in various ways from the substance of the claims, we can maybe get them to be notational variants in that they both want to give the same truth conditions ultimately, but it seems that there are different ways of thinking about how that comes about.
But you would want to specify what the arrangement is somehow in specifying what the meaning is. So you have this subject, verb, object. Every man loves a woman. And then somehow you stick onto some expression representing the arrangement in providing a representation of the meaning under one reading or the other.
Right, and so the different arrangements are possible. There's the arrangement in which men are related to women, stand in the loving relation to women, sort of one to each one, and there's a relation in which all the men stand to one. And a woman, I think, just makes both of those available because it allows for one single woman and it allows for some woman or other, and that's part of the ambiguity of the word a. So I think that's the way I would treat it, and that seems to me different from saying that underlying the sentence there are two different logical structures, because I think there's just one logical structure and there are ambiguous terms used in the sentence. So you might think that's not a good account, but it strikes me as a different account.
To pursue a little more the perceptual analogy, so a photograph can be of something, of a building, for instance, and there is a causal element in that relation, in that being of that. But then there is something else. A photograph typically ascribes features to the thing of which it's intended to be, maybe wrongly, but it does, and that is related to how, among the many things that cause the photographer or the machine, we determine what the photograph is of. So typically we would think that there is a counterfactual dependence between the properties that the building or the thing of which the photograph is of may have had, and then the properties that correspondingly the photograph would have ascribed to it. So if the photograph would have been, if the building would have been bigger, then perhaps the photograph would have been ascribed to it a bigger size, things like that. Okay, is there anything like that on your view in the connection between, in the causal connection determining, constituting reference on your view between the plurality of men and our use of the word man, or the connection between the plurality of witches, empty, I guess, and the word, our use of the word witch? Is there something like that? It seems that you don't want that because you seem to call denotation anything that ascribe features to the thing.
Yeah. So,
but if you don't have anything like that, it's a total mystery what you call reference to me.
right. So so there's a question about what it takes to perceive one thing through another thing, and in the case of photographs, it's tempting anyway to give an account along the lines of what you described, that there has to be some covariance of features and maybe features represented or something like that. That is actually, though, I find that actually is quite a complicated set of ideas, because this kind of thing is not, this has been explored by other people, particularly in the literature on photography and aesthetics, that it's not clear what notions of similarity and resemblance are called upon to make out those claims. So, you say if the building had been bigger, it would have looked bigger, but that isn't necessarily true. There's all, photographs can distort in all sorts of ways, and so there's a lot of subtle issues about what kind of similarity relations. Well, for one thing, what a similarity relation between a representation and a represented thing is, and for another thing, how they should be characterized or made out. Of course, it's true that the word man doesn't resemble men in any sort of ordinary way. And I guess my thought about that is that not all perceiving through has to be similarity or sort of qualitative similarity or resemblance based. That we can have symbols that go away from any sort of qualitative representation or attempt to capture the way the thing is in a kind of internal way, that nonetheless are devices for, passing awareness of that thing to someone else, keeping awareness of that thing going in our own minds. This is the kind of perceiving through or referring through that I am sort of now in the process of developing for language. There's a split, I think, between, or rather, I guess what I want to argue is that qualitative similarity isn't a requirement for being a device of perception, and that in that way, words can fit the bill as much as photos can.
Yeah, the point was merely that, speaking of causal relations without saying anything more is given very little. That at least maybe this theory I was gesturing to is mistaken in the details, but we have something to work with. Just mentioning the causal relation doesn't do almost anything. It doesn't fix anything in terms of what the relation is between the word, the uses of the word, and these pluralities or whatever. That was the point. I mean, you have to say something more. Maybe it's not. Maybe in the end you can say something that doesn't involve ascribing features or ascribing, representing the thing as something. Maybe. But
I mean, I think you can. I think you can perceive a thing as its name. So its name is its perceptible form in your awareness. But that's something to be worked out. I mean, of course, you're right that more needs to be said. The point of just drawing the distinction between reference and denotation in terms of the role of causation was that actually that's all you need for that distinction. For sure, more needs to be said about what the relation is and how it works. I'm not sure how much philosophers can say about that, but exploring reference as a form of perception rather than as a form of denotation, as a form of sort of rule-governed picking out of things, seems to me to be promising and sort of suggested by the Putnamian kind of considerations that I talked about.
Okay, so it's a question about how you think about the project and maybe a suggestion. So at some points you talk about how one striking thing is we don't get any clauses or axioms or anything, rules that we can use to derive we get some examples and then you tell us how it works in those cases, but we didn't get a general procedure, which would be nice because in like type 3 cases, it gets complicated very quickly and I wouldn't know how to just keep going, every man kicked his brother in the knee in the dark under the staircase, and I can go on and it looks, like how does it work when it keeps going like that? It would be nice to have something systematic. I mean, maybe you think you do have that, and you could have a semantic clause that looked like a normal semantic theory. So I guess that is one question. Do you just don't want to have them, or you just didn't put them on? But I was thinking maybe the answer is that isn't the goal. And then if that isn't the goal, this isn't an alternative to other semantic theories. It's a model of speech or content grasping on the model of perception, which is a project you could run parallel to and not in competition with the goal of constructing a formal semantic theory that derives the content of each from a finite set of axioms, or however you want to do your compositional theory. So I was thinking, you don't give us anything like that. Maybe you just don't want to, and if you don't want to, maybe it just isn't the same kind of project, and then they don't have to be competitors.
So I guess the competitive element the competitive element is that there's an assumption that the truth conditions in natural language can be, the computation thereof can be laid out in the kind of way you're suggesting, which is not something that we expect for perceptual systems. We don't expect to give a, formal semantic theory of vision with transparent rules that will set out how I compute an image from, some surface data or something like that. That's viewed. It's not that they're uncomputable. Obviously, our brains are computing, but we don't view it as something that has to be sort of set out on a page in a Tarskian format or something like that. So I guess the way in which I feel like I wouldn't want to say this is just totally compatible with that project is that I'm trying to argue that the theory of natural language is much more like the theory of vision or audition or something like that, and that natural language meaning just is the perceptibility in this extended sense of things via the faculty of language. So I don't expect that those kinds of clauses would be so readily available.
No, I do think then you just think, so suppose someone said, no, I agree with all everything you said, but I think there are these abstract structures, languages, I'm going to construct a formal system for them in certain kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have these psychologistic assumptions that you attribute to me. That would be a project you would be perfectly happy with. Someone could construct these formal systems, and it wouldn't be a competitor of yours.
Somebody could construct formal systems, but whether that would be a description of English is contestable. That's a question I would contest. So of course you can construct any formal system you want. The question is that a description of English or any other natural language? And that's where I think it's not.
So, Eros, you want to? Can you make it very quick? Very, very quick.
Just in order to be sure I understand you, it seems that vision, a priori, we can claim is kind of universal across culture, across and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, some people can go to claim that language as well is sort of universal and so on and so forth. So, well, why we don't want to have a computation of language, which somewhat captures kind of the language acquisition device or whatever, or the universal grammar and so on and so forth. Because if you equate vision and language, well, it seems that language, it doesn't work like vision. Well, there are some computation, there are some and so on and so forth, if you go along with the Chomskyan way. And, well, so we should have at some point to have a kind of command repository of computation. And, well, to do it, it will be difficult, it seems to me, to do in denying or kind of logical form or grammatical form or syntactic form, whatever you want to call it, what we don't have sort of in vision.
Can you just repeat I'm sorry, the microphone is kind of blurring. So,
well, vision is, among human beings, is universal.
right.
Well, some people go to claim that language as well, among human people, is universal or got some universal features. So it's not a question of, so when you perceive English or you perceive Italian and so on and so forth, well, at the end, if you extend the metaphor of perception, well, what you perceive, what you end up to process are some computation, which are, and how can we deal or can we spell them out without sort of appealing some sort of grammatical form or logical form or syntactic form or whatever.
Language is like vision, but it's not the same, and there are many different senses, of course, and they all work a bit differently. So one feature of language is that it gets exhibited in different ways, so people learn different languages. I don't think that means you need to appeal to an underlying universal form that everyone is operating with. I think rather it just means that when you talk about the way people use a particular language, or if you want to put it this way, the way people use language in a particular way, so in the English way or the Spanish way or whatever, that still what you are dealing with is an instantiation of a perceptual system. And so you can treat the language itself still as it's still a historical object, in the sense that these chains of word uses through which I pick up words and, in this extended sense, perceive things through words is a real thing in history, and there's different ones in different parts of the world. But so that fact doesn't mean that you don't treat them as being processed by a perceptual system. And I don't think you need to, at least it's not immediately clear that you need to then postulate a universal syntax that's somehow underlying all the distinct ones that people use.
Okay, so thank you. And well, thank you everybody, and I guess